So the article is in national interest. It's called "America Must Grapple with the Limits of Ukraine's Kursk Offensive," and in there, you make, one of the points that you make is that, the Biden administration has been super committed to the war in Ukraine, and really whoever wins, it's not clear, right, that level of commitment is gonna continue for the next like starting now or starting next year.
Yeah, well, Derek, you go first, because what do you think about, like, if Trump or Kamala is elected? Because what's the difference between institutional inertia, or the relative effects of institutional inertia and political inertia, and the war just not going well flat out for quite a while at this point?
I mean, you can't keep announcing like 8 billion here, 9 billion there when they're clearly losing, which they're I don't want to overstate the difficulties that Ukraine has had, but they're not winning the big counteroffensive. I was actually a little bit surprised that the utter failure of the big counteroffensive didn't change public opinion more than it has. I think it's soured people a little bit, or it's increased support for peace talks. It seems like,
right, some sort of negotiation,
the sort of like, we don't want this to be an unending spigot of money and weapons. Like, there has to be some movement toward at least having conversations about how this ends. But even if we assume that Kamala wins, the desire, the willingness to continue this indefinitely, I think is just not there. And if there's no hope of a settlement, or if it looks like the only thing that's going to happen the longer this goes on is Russia's position is going to strengthen, and it's going to be harder for the Ukrainians to make a peace deal that's even remotely favorable, not favorable, but acceptable, then people are gonna see that. And I mean, obviously, if Trump wins, the money's gonna get cut off. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw his thing with Zelensky.
No, I saw him walk.
They couldn't have been more. I mean, they couldn't have been more kind of uncomfortable with each other. And Trump, they did their like press thing at the after they talked, and Trump was just openly like talking about he's sure that Vladimir Putin doesn't want this to keep going on, and he can make a great deal with Putin, and Putin, and Zelensky's just standing there next to him, looking at him like, what are you talking about? It was very awkward, and I think if Zelensky's hope was that he was going to sell Trump on this big victory plan that he's been chomping around to Biden and Harris, it clearly doesn't seem to have worked.
So Trump will, and do you think Kamala will just basically slowly turn off the spigot, not mention it? Like it's actually kind of interesting. Her campaign, and I would bet this would actually be an approach to public communication, is just like not going to say shit. It's very successful for them if they win. That is, they might lose, but if they do win, just like don't have her say stuff. Like, you don't actually need it
to anything.
Yeah, you don't actually. It turns out like you don't need them
to commit to anything anyway.
Right, she doesn't have any core, ideological core. It seems
yeah, I mean, I think they'll keep going, as long as they can get away with it. A lot of it depends on Congress too. I mean, you remember how difficult it was to get the last aid package for Ukraine passed. That's probably going to get. Well, I mean, it depends on how things shake out. If the Democrats lose the Senate, which I think is almost a certainty, it would be very difficult for them to even get back to 50-50, given the way that the map lines up. They could, in theory, if Kamala wins and has coattails, they could maybe take the House. But if they don't have control of both chambers, then I think they're going to run into the same. It might be a little bit easier in the Senate. Who knows? Because the Republicans in the Senate are frankly just older and more like they're less, right. They're more wedded to the institution, more Cold War type. So that might make it easier for her to get more aid through Congress. But I think they'll just kind of like keep going, but maybe wind down. I don't think you're going to see a point where there's like a public statement like this has to end or we have to do something different. But they'll de-emphasize it as long as it continues to go in this kind of slow-moving Russian victory way, which is depressing to talk about for them and for their for the base.
Yeah, it is. It is. I agree. But guys, quick thing, just to show how the sausage is made. You guys can't hear it clicking, can you? I think it's just in my ears. No.
I can't hear it clicking now.
Okay, good. Okay, good.
I don't hear anything.
No. So no, I totally agree with that, Derek. And so it'll be interesting to see. Do you think there's any chance that the failure of this war is going to reframe anything? Because at this point, my entire adult life has just been the U.S. lurching from disaster to disaster. So, like, is this it? Is this just the institutional inertia? Nothing could ever change. We're in hell world, as they used to say.
I mean, what's it gonna? What would it change?
Right,
Like
so
they'll try as long as there is a Ukraine at the end of this that isn't, if it ended right now, and the Ukrainians said, whatever, these parts of the Donbass and Crimea, we're not gonna say we recognize them as Russian, but effectively we're not gonna try to take them back. We'll just leave it as this kind of open sore. Then they'll claim victory. They'll say that the goal was always to conquer all of Ukraine and bring it back into Russia, and we saved them, and they'll say it was a very successful operation, and I think it'll just continue on.
Right. Even if the actual deal at the end of it is probably much worse for Ukraine than what could have happened in spring of 2022.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
seems
that's
accepted now. Yeah,
that seems pretty clear. But they'll ignore that, and they'll just go with the worst case scenario and say this is even though up to this point the Ukrainians themselves, Zelensky and company, have been talking about total victory. That they won't get that, and they'll still kind of say, we did it, everybody.
That is so. There's just no changing anything. If events have zero chance of changing things, what do we do?
Well, okay, so I wonder about that. Because I mean, obviously everything Derek just said is the ring of truth, right? That the sort of is whenever the war does finally grind to some kind of bloody halt, then there's going to be this way worse peace deal that happens now, but the narrative will be retconned, and and if you're sort of listening to mainstream media or what most politicians say, that'll just be the line, right? Like that sounds totally true. But I also wonder, I mean, if you think back to February of 2022, it really did feel like the way people were talking about Ukraine. I mean, this is kind of a revival of, like, I don't know, national purpose, right? It's like, people, like, you had this kind of level of excited liberal patriotism that, I hadn't seen for a long time. And the facts that, it went this dismally. I mean, even if nobody actually reckons with that fact, which people don't do that, right? But even if that's the case, I mean, does that make it harder to sort of whip up the same level of frenzy when the next thing happens in the world?
It doesn't seem to have, because, like, if you even remember in the run up to Ukraine, they were constantly arguing in favor of it. I remember I wrote something before the invasion, and it just, no one cared. It was very weird. Like, there was the entire left liberal part of the coalition just didn't care. Like, Iraq and Afghanistan had never happened, so why would it change?
Yeah, I don't. I'm kind of with Danny on this. I don't know. I'm very pessimistic, and it's not just about this. It's I'm sure we want to stick to Ukraine and not talk about what's going on in the Middle East. But
well, I mean, we can certainly touch on that.
This is a very dismal time for.
Yeah.
for
Well,
US
that's
foreign
the
policy.
interesting historical question. And Ben, I think I told you about this piece in Periodist Realism I've got going out about it.
Yep.
That's the most interesting thing. You know, I'm actually reviewing Chomsky's book now. My big critique is like Chomsky's theory of politics is wrong, which is that information will lead to change. That is the fundamental assumption of his entire political career, and is fundamentally wrong. And like, understandably, he's an elderly man right now, so he's not going to start rethinking things at 94 or whatever he is. But it was just fundamentally wrong. It's an incorrect assumption about how politics works in the 20th and 21st centuries. Maybe it was true at different times. I am a little doubtful, but whatever. So then, what do you do with that, right? And this is an ultimate problem for the left and left thinkers. And just to be honest, I think this is a major result. A major consequence of a lot of the ennui and the nihilism that you see sweeping through the left. There's a truth to that ennui and nihilism, right? It's not coming from nowhere. It's not just coming from the loss of Bernie. It's coming from a recognition of the actual structure of power in American society, reflected by the Ukraine thing, where in the run-up to the war, all the left liberals who had been critical of Iraq and Afghanistan were just in favor of fucking arming Ukraine. It just did, and thereby strengthening the empire. So if nothing is going to change, then nothing's going to change. And that's the affect of the 21st century in which we live, I think.
Yeah. So in some ways, your take on Chomsky is like the sorry to bother you theory, right? Like I don't know if you remember that. You know, I don't know if you watched.
I know
that
of
movie,
it, but
right?
I've never seen it. Yeah, with the horses and
yeah. That's so there's a point in the movie where the big science fiction horror premise, the whole thing is very publicly revealed on TV, and then nobody does anything. And there's like even like kind of a line of dialogue about like, yeah, if you just tell people something really upsetting, but they have nothing to do about, you know, but you don't really give them anything concrete, you know, that they can do about it. They just kind of go back to ignoring it, right? Because what, you know, what good is it going to do them to focus on it? But I mean, so your point, right? I mean, so like, and I mean Derek's point too. The counterpoint to, oh, maybe this went so badly that, you know, people draw some conclusions, is, you know, that look, there weren't very many months between the beginning of the Ukraine war and you know the after the end of America's 20-year debacle in Afghanistan. And it seemed like the theory of the case that a lot of liberals who had been opposed to Bush's wars in the Middle East, certainly at least Iraq, but you know maybe in general, and even a lot of people on the sort of liberal adjacent left, that you know a lot of their theory of the case was basically like, okay, well, those wars were bad because the you know the empire was being used to do a bad thing, which was to invade other countries. But Ukraine is good because in this case, the sort of might of America's imperial global presence is being used to do a good thing, which is being to save somebody from being invaded. And so the ideology there is that it's just sort of this neutral instrument that, you know, that sometimes happens to be used to do bad things. Of course, that's bad, but you know, it could equally be used to do good things, and you know, that would be good when it happens.
But that is just a totally naive understanding and ahistorical understanding of the entirety of U.S. history. So then, what do you say to someone like that, right? Like,
Yeah, well,
there's just nothing to say. They're like, okay, that's totally wrong empirically, and one might even say theoretically, but more important, empirically. You don't get the good parts of the empire without the bad. So if you're not going to see that, there's only so much that I could say to you, you know? So, and it feels kind of pointless, frankly.
I mean, yeah, the master's tools aren't going to be used to take down the master's house, basically. Like you can't count on all the wars being good wars from now on, right? It's the institutions and the arms industry and the $1 trillion Pentagon budget. Those are the things that are the problem. And you know, look at what's happened. You had Ukraine and everybody, you know, who was bummed out by Iraq and Afghanistan got to say, hooray, the United States is the good guy. Isn't this great? And then we turned around and backstopped a genocide in Gaza and, you know, enabled the slide into war in the Middle East.
Right. So it's like,
this
at
is what
this
we
point,
do. This is
what are
just
you
what we
even
do.
arguing with, right? I'm just
Right.
bored arguing with people like that because they're just not seeing reality. So you're not going to force them to. Ben, what do you think about this? Because your whole thing is about giving them an argument.
Yeah,
you know?
sure. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm neurotically attached to the project. I mean, I'm still going to do it, but yeah, I mean, this is like, I think that this, I think that this is one of the things that it's often uh hardest to convince people of, because they're thinking of these as just sort of individual, policy decisions. It's like, domestic policy. You support this law, right? You oppose this law. If you're, if you're, banning, if you're banning same-sex marriage, that's bad. If you're banning child labor, that's good, right? Which I think is obviously a correct approach to take to domestic law. But the idea that the military industrial complex, to use the old-fashioned term, that the sort of that maintaining this level of American presence in the world militarily, that this could be a package deal that has consequences, that that's like, you know that are going to reverberate in other parts of the world and other conflicts, that you have to at some point just pull back from the entire project. I think that is kind of a gestalt switch for a lot of people, and I think a lot of well-intentioned people, right? It's not just that there's sort of it's not just that there are people who are just like so hopelessly ideologically captured that that there's just like nothing you can do. Obviously those people exist too, right? But it is also the case that I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily starting from a place where they're just completely immune from the the appeal of a sort of anti-interventionist project or whatever, like are still very stuck in that way of seeing it, that this is just like domestic policy, that that you should, that you support the good things and oppose the bad things. And so I don't entirely know the answer, how to sort of convince people that
Well, I don't
that
think you can. Like the entire
yeah.
left liberal side of the spectrum was
That's such
lined
a
like
level
people.
of delusion.
Yeah, it's just such a level of delusion and ahistorical ignorance that like it's absurd. Like I remember when I went on the Majority Report, and we haven't been invited back since.
Yeah, thanks
Sam
for that,
Cedar,
by the way.
yeah, Sam Cedar asked me like, "What do you do with Ukraine?" I'm like, "Nothing," and it like literally their audience like lost their mind. Like they could not like comprehend that. It was like so funny. Like people were freaking out. And it's just like that's just like someone who's lost, who has no appreciation for what actual empirical history shows you. It's just nothing is going to change that. And then beyond that, there are people I know we're all thinking of who are like on the liberal, like sort of the liberal side of the left liberal, like dirtbag podcast, all that shit. And they like lined up like totally 1-on-1 behind Ukraine. So like it just shows that they're not really part of your coalition. They're never going to be part of your coalition. The fact that they couldn't see that this is directly connected to something like the US support for Israel is like, okay, what do you do in that situation? There's nothing to do.
I mean, to take
Yeah.
a very
Yeah.
to take an example that doesn't get a lot of headlines, but probably should. The United States floods the planet with weapons. Like we are by far
Which
the
I talked about in
largest
that piece,
supplier of
Derek, I wrote
arms
for you.
around the world. And you don't get to have the $1 trillion military to do good things with, to wield like some kind of righteous sword and only do good things with, without building the kind of defense complex that demands the right for profits, for corporate profits, to sell those weapons all over the world. And so it's just impossible to have the one without the other. And if you think it's bad that American small arms are fueling, rampant gang violence in Mexico, or that we're, selling landmines or cluster bombs rather that are going to be, you know, going off 20 years from now and maiming kids because they don't always detonate when they're supposed to. You know, if you think those things are bad, but you think that the military, you know, the $1 trillion military is good, you can't square that circle. It's just not. These things are intimately connected. There's not. You don't have one without the other. So I mean, I don't know. People don't want to believe that. But again, I think it's a delusion. As I said earlier,
it's a delusion. Yes.
Delusional.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, actually, I think the way that you just put it is really good. And of course, you know, the whole discussion makes me think of the kind of stuff that Danny was putting out a few years ago and, you know, much, you know, comparatively much less depressing times, right? You know,
we had hope. We had hope, Leo. We had hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's you know, wheels always turning. You know, maybe by the time he's able to be aware of politics,
when he's fighting the climate wars, when he's like the John Connor of the climate wars, that's when I'm training him to be.
Exactly. Yeah. So at the, you know, but the stuff you're putting out back then was kind of a, you know, a lot of it was about sort of how to navigate stepping back from empire, right? Like, so
Right.
if like Bernie Sanders had become president and, you know, we got like the best possible version of the Bernie foreign policy, right? That how, you know, how you would do that. And I remember some of the conversations that I had with you back then were all about, you know, essentially the, you know, how to deal with that majority report question, right? Like, so, cause, you know, it's maybe even one thing. And look, I mean, if that were me, I mean, I probably would have emphasized the sort of like short-term answer. It's like, well, you promote, you know, peace talks, and that's actually going to be better for everybody, and blah blah blah, right? And
I got to give it to him hard, dude. Uncut, blow their minds.
That's all correct as far as it goes, right? But like, clearly, in the long run, your answer has to be the right one, right? That, in other words, that like, yeah, whatever the United States, you know, should concretely be doing in, you know, Ukraine, or we could like go through different parts of the country where, you know, they, you know, you could at least see potentially really bad consequences from, you know, from drawdown of empire along with all the good ones. Then, you know, I don't know, the Koreas, you know, whatever, like you go through all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, whatever the sort of short term, like, okay, here's what we could do in the next 6 months that, you know, that would sort of manage the that. It's like, look, you're either going to do a transition to not having a global empire, or you're not.
Right, or you're not. Right. And I think all these people don't actually want to, because I think they're infected with a ultimately religiously, but now secularized millenarianism. And that it just made me realize that like these people actually can't be comrades. Like, if the ultimate, I think one of Mike Davis's last things he wrote was like, down with empire now, down with empire yesterday, and down with empire forever, right? Like, that's like a fundamental thing, right? And if you don't have that fundamental thing, you actually can't really be part of a working foreign policy coalition. Maybe you could work on domestic issues together, but like a lot of there's just no coalition to be built if that is not your ultimate goal. If you don't see the connection between flooding weapons into Ukraine and the continuation of the US empire, which does things like send weapons to Israel, then what are we talking about? Then we're living in basically two realities. Maybe that's a strong way to put it, but what do you guys think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You don't get to have one without the other, basically. Like you can't. I mean, just on a purely political level, you would think people would get this, right? Like you don't get to elect your faves every 4 years and have, you know, whoever it is. If it's Joe Biden, if it's Barack Obama, if it's Donald Trump. I mean, it doesn't matter. You don't get to win every time, and so there's always going to be a point at which the massive might of this thing that you think is should only be used for good is going to be wielded by somebody you think is bad, and they're going to do things that you think are bad, and sometimes they're going to do the same things that you would find, you know, good or you know, praiseworthy if they were being done by somebody on your team. But nevertheless, like, it doesn't work. Nothing about this system works that way. Nothing about the way the U.S. operates works so that you can just get the goodies all the time without any minuses. It just doesn't. It's
and
not
I mean,
feasible.
To put a finer point on that, right? Like, look, if we, um, if we stopped having this massive arms production industry in the United States, we didn't have, we stopped being the kind of country that that had hundreds of military bases around the world, that had this just unbelievable stockpile of weapons, which and to clear, right? I mean, it's like the commitment, certainly the dual commitment to the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza has actually like severely strained even that completely ridiculous stockpile of weapons, right? So it's like, if you didn't have all that, right, like if you had drawn down from all of that by say 2021, then yeah, when you are in situations like February 2022 and there's like a local war that breaks out in some other region of the world, then the answer would have to be nothing at that point, because there would be literally nothing you could do, right? Just like there are any number of countries around the world that it's like they're just not particularly in a position to do anything one way or the other when something happens around the world. And so I think the question is, do you think that the world would be better off if we drew down the empire to the point where we were in that position where it's like, where whatever we thought morally we should do, there just would be nothing to do, or not, right? And I mean, I think all three of us think, yeah, very clearly that would be better, right? But
it's not even a question, right? So like, this is what's so annoying about like people getting so mad. It's just like they don't know, it's like they just don't know what the U.S. has actually done. Like it's not even a question. It's so. The times the United States has intervened in foreign regimes, the times the United States had flooded the world with weapons, the times the United States has prosecuted racialized wars that resulted in the death, destruction, and deracination of tens of millions of people over and over and over again. So what do you say to someone who's just like, here, you're just like, here's the history. And they're like, no, it doesn't say that.
Yeah,
Oh, no,
well,
this time will be different. Like, okay, that's not like a serious thing. So then what are we even talking about? Let's go.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, I think some of what you just said actually is a good thing to say. I also think that Derek's point earlier that I took some notes, so I make sure I did forget this. Money is fungible. That the same money that you can spend on the military could in fact be spent on other things. Like also seems like a relevant point for building public support for that position. But because I mean, it's like I remember
I'm going to copyright that. Money is fungible. I don't think anybody's ever said that before. I'm the first.
No, I think this is a new insight. I'll yeah,
money can be exchanged for goods and services.
Yeah, exactly.
We're breaking ground here.
Yeah, I mean, there's the I remember, there was that tweet that was going around, well, when the United States, had, well, the within the last year version of when the United States started bombing Yemen is obviously not for the first time that ever happened, but like that was like a picture of a giant aircraft carrier, and it said like, the Houthis are about to find out why we don't have healthcare, and it's like, well, that is true.
Have they found out yet? It's months and months later. Have they found out yet? Because I don't know.
Yeah, it turns out we don't have healthcare, so we could pursue military adventures that actually aren't even successful. Right?
Yeah, that's it. That's the payoff.
Yeah. Good job.
No,
yeah,
it's wild. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah. So
the admission of that, like to have people who are ostensibly on the left of center, liberal or whatever, say we don't, to make that connection, we don't have universal health care so that we can bomb this like remote country, tiny remote country that's been pounded by US weapons for almost a decade now, so we can beat it up further. And that's the reason we don't have universal health care. That's astonishing that people would say that in a positive sense.
Yeah, right. And again, to put a fine point on this, right, like didn't even work, right? Like
right,
it's
right. I mean, it didn't even. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And actually, so this really brings us to the actual article, right?
The actual problem, which is, Ben, I need to get back on Majority Report. What are you doing to contribute to that cause?
I'll work on that for you.
Tell them I'll come back on.
Derek's happy to go back alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, Derek.
Like I've been on there before
what
by
Danny
myself.
said
It went
cool,
fine. Like,
right? Like that's
we actually
like
pitched Derek. We wound up pitching them again, like when the war was going bad, in like an actual friendly way. I thought it would have been interesting to be like, let's actually talk about this, right? Like it seems so extreme, but once again, certain geniuses are proven correct over and over. So let's talk about that.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
also invited Emma to come on our debate stream, which we're never doing again. But they were doing something themselves, so she couldn't do it.
Which debate stream? Did we do a debate stream?
Yeah, the first one, the Biden one.
Oh, the debate.
When we sat there for 2 hours and said, "Oh my God, is this man alive?"
Yeah, like, I thought you meant me and you debating.
He died on stage.
Yeah.
No. The presidential debate.
Yeah. The presidential debate. Yeah. But they were doing something. That wasn't else.
I mean, look, if nothing else, I mean, it's probably, long after the details of much more recent presidential debates have faded from my memory, right? In decades, I'm still going to remember watching it. It'll
yeah, that was a memorable experience.
It's kind of like me and I saw Megalopolis. I'm like, this is one of the most memorable movie experiences in my entire life.
Yeah, so I hear. I haven't seen it. Yeah. Okay. So the actual, article, you're talking about the the limits of the Kursk offensive, and this is, and I think this does, there is probably a way to talk about this that, kind of brings in, like Derek had earlier been raising some of the analogies, with the Middle East, because, of course, the disanalogy is that, the United States is, in the Ukrainian case, funding people who, got invaded, right? Whereas
right.
the Palestine case, obviously, very, very, very much, not that situation, but just the kind of dynamics of thinking that, like, the next thing is going to be when you achieve a military solution to like long grinding bloody conflicts, and like forget all those naysayers who want you to negotiate, just do the next thing, is, I think, one that you could see playing out a lot in both, and so this is, I think that, like, when this offensive started, like, say, hey, look, man, all of you negative Nellies had been saying that this is like an unwinnable war, but look, Ukrainians actually going into Russian territory, they're so taking the initiative, so why didn't that work out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right. I think there's the dynamic of just give us this one more thing. Like, we just need permission for this one more thing. We just need F-16s. We just need to invade Russia. We just need the long range weapons, and then we just need you to, give us permission to use them, more broadly. We just need you to promise us that we'll get into NATO. This is all like it's always the next thing that's going to win the war for the Ukrainians. And it's the same with Israel. Although the dynamic there is, if we just kill a few more people, this will be like, just let us kill this one more guy. If we kill Nasrallah, it'll be, that'll end it. If we kill Sinwar, that'll end it. Or if we kill a couple thousand people in the Bekaa Valley, that'll end it. Like, it's just it's always just one more death away from paradise. But it's the same. Like, fundamentally, the process works the same way. What happened in Kursk, and I think we say this in the piece, and it's important to note this. Like, the Ukrainians achieved several real successes. I mean, what I think happened is that the invasion was started out as the means to achieve several ends, and it achieved some of them, but then it became an end in itself, and that's where we are now. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So the incursion, as I say, it achieved a number of things. It reinvigorated to some degree Ukrainian morale, which had been wavering since the failure of the counteroffensive, and with this steady Russian progression in the east along the front line. was flagging. It reinvigorated interest among the support network in the West, which, like it or not, is fundamentally is fundamental to Ukraine's ability to defend itself at this point.
Right.
They were able to take hundreds of prisoners. One of the things that the Ukrainians were worried about prior to this is that they had no more prisoners to exchange for the thousands of Ukrainian POWs that Russia still holds, and they took I think around 600 prisoners, and that fueled 2 major prisoner swaps. So this was these were all things that they achieved. There were other aims or other ends that they didn't achieve. I think they wanted a bigger kind of panicky Russian response that would have pulled a larger number of forces out of Ukraine to deal with this incursion. That didn't happen. The Russians continued to advance along the front line. In some cases, around Pokrovsk, for a while there, they were moving faster than they had before the Kursk invasion began. That's slowed down in recent weeks, but still, that the effect there, I don't think, was what they had hoped for. The danger to me becomes, instead of achieving these aims, which you could have done, it seems to me, in an in and out kind of attack. We go in, take out the border guards, capture a bunch of prisoners, show the Russians that we can do this, that we're capable of it, show the West that we're capable of it, give everybody a shot in the arm, and then withdraw and just say, we can do this anytime we want at any point on the border. And that's, that to me is a even bigger threat than occupying the territory. But they stayed. So they're now occupying this, this portion of Russian territory along the border for who knows how long. I mean, the Russian response hasn't been particularly energetic, and I know there's been a lot of Kremlinology about that. Is Putin panicking? Does he not know what to do? I think it's more likely they just don't care. They're happy to have these thousands of Ukraine's most seasoned, best equipped troops sitting here doing nothing in this pocket of territory, just holding on to it. That's not relevant particularly to the Russians. It's certainly not as relevant as what they're trying to do in Ukraine. And so they're just allowing this to continue. But if they decide at some point not to allow it to continue, and they decide to go after, to drive these forces out or encircle them, which is the big threat, what are the Ukrainians going to do? Are they going to be prepared to pull these soldiers out before they lose them, or are they going to risk losing them? And that to me is the issue. And now that they're sort of committed to holding the territory, for what end, I don't know. I guess they think they can trade it in an eventual peace negotiation,
right.
But that seems incredibly unlikely that they can hold on to it that long, because we don't. I mean, who knows when that's even going to be a reality. The issue is they're committed now to holding on to this territory. So withdrawing will be seen as a retreat. It will be seen as a defeat. And it'll undercut all that morale stuff that the positive morale effects that the initial incursion may have had.
Aside for Derek's totally inappropriate criticism of the proud discipline of Kremlinology, I agree, and I do think that this suggests that the United States should not do things like this. Is that it's the old Clausewitzian principle: war is too unpredictable to just run into it headlong. But that's a lesson that's not going to be learned. So we face this weird affective thing I've been calling imperialist realism. And then the question, I think, for the left is, how do you get out of that? And that I have no fucking idea. Like that, I genuinely have no idea how that proceeds. I think Bernie was a Hail Mary pass. That sometimes you catch those. This time we didn't. So then what do you do? And I genuinely have no idea.
Yeah. I'm still banking on Leo's John Connor moment and
his turn.
The 2040s. No, that's fair. So and I mean, this is like in some ways friend Kuba, who couldn't join us today, right? Like I saw him say that they as a strategic thing, right? And I think this is separate from Derek's point about the sort of kind of immediate tactical upside as far as POWs to swap and even the sort of propaganda effects that, like, just as like a move in the actual war. I mean, part of the reason that the Russians might have been relatively unprepared for this is it was a little unclear what the point was, right? That he said, it's a little bit like if Canadian forces were struggling to save Vancouver from American invaders, and they grabbed, and so Canada grabbed a truck stop and a little bit of prairie, around Fargo. Um, that so it's just like, as a, like, this is going to help us in the war, in more than the sort of tactical and propaganda sense, right? Like it seems like, yeah, it seems like the thinking is a little bit unclear, unless Zelensky really does think that he can just like hold on to it, for long enough to swap it. But that's interesting in and of itself if he does, right? Because like that does suggest moving in the relatively near future towards towards a negotiated settlement, which has definitely not been the rhetoric very recently.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, Derek, do you think we'll
Yeah.
just grind on? What do you think's going to happen?
I mean, I think that the Russians are going to take the rest of Donetsk. It's going to take a while because they're not moving fast, but they're moving in a number of directions, and they seem to be at the point where they can't move on multiple parts of the line, but whatever part they decide to focus on in any given week, the Ukrainians can't defend all of it, so they just identify the area that they can push on, and they push, and they roll through villages and towns. I think they'll get to the extent of Donetsk, which would give them control of the full Donbass, and that's a point where they could say, not we're going to end. I mean, not that we're
Sure.
done, but that we're going to take a an operational pause or something, because they'd be quite happy, I think, at this point to have the Ukrainians come to them and say, okay, we can live with this. So I suspect they will, kind of ratchet down the tempo at that point. And then, the Ukrainians will have to decide what they want to do. I mean, uh, there's still this idea of total victory. I mean, this is the plan, the big new victory plan that Zelensky's been shopping around. He took to Biden and, showed to Kamala Harris and showed to Donald Trump, that apparently just includes like a bunch of stuff they've already asked for, like permission to use long range weapons, which again is it's just the next thing, bro. Like, let me do the next thing, and then that'll be it. We'll win. And it also includes the NATO demand, which, if that was going to happen, would have happened a long time ago. They're not getting an assurance of NATO membership. So yeah, I mean, I just that move in particular, to me, and I don't want to like psychoanalyze Zelensky, but it seems very cynically to be setting up blame for defeat, not actually trying to establish the conditions for anything that could be called victory. It feels like something that you would do if you're trying to, if you want to be able to, at
You're
the end
setting
of
the
this,
stage.
point to the U.S. and say they didn't give us what we needed to win the war.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that seems right. So I mean, this is, and we should say, by the way, too, it is worth noting in all of this, right? Obviously, the focus here is appropriately on, American foreign policy, but that that there's like there's a Russian equivalent to this conversation that's like, man, what do we like, what do we get out of this, right? I mean, this is that there's something that is like, like imperial ineptness is not only for the big guy, right? Like this is like 2.5 years of like, maybe we'll keep grinding until we get all of the Donbass, and then there's some kind of settlement. I've got to think, from a sort of why can't we have social spending in Russia perspective, that also feels pretty grim.
Well, as someone who's been personally sanctioned by the Russian government, I will not comment on the the policies of one of the greatest countries in the world. But yeah, it's difficult to know. My understanding, Derek, is that it's actually difficult to know what's going on inside Russia. That it's just tough to know and has been for a long time, and things like public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's no good. What do you rely on, right? The media environment is very closed off. The polling, that always gives Putin, 99% or 80% support or whatever. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and there's no. I mean, one thing, there's no indication of what we saw at the beginning of this, which was even small kind of anti-war protests that were heavily cracked down on by the Russian state. I haven't seen any indication of that.
Yeah, it seems like all that stuff was pretty effectively crushed early on.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how popular things are. You keep hearing about these like, Telegram channels that are secretly, kind of posting the real casualty figures and trying to shock people into like, this is not going as well as Putin says it is, and that kind of thing. But I have no idea if that has any effect.
Danny, what you just mentioned is, since obviously there's been a whole conversation talking about incredibly grim subjects, but you just mentioned one of the funniest fucking things that is true, that's happened over the course of the whole conflict. So for people who don't follow their Danny Bessner lore, that is literally true. Who's personally sanctioned by Russia? How the fuck did that happen?
I think it was random. Like, I think they had to fill some quota. Like, actually, I think they just had to fill some quota. And so I was a victim of that quota filling, of bureaucracy. Once again, I was a victim of bureaucracy.
So there's like somebody at the Russian analog of the State Department who's just like, okay, I need to find 5 more American commentators to sanction, and he's like doing a bunch of Google searches. And he reads like 2 sentences of something he wrote. It's like, whatever, good enough.
I don't even think he read. I think it was just on a list of international relations professors.
Fair enough. Well,
yeah, I don't think this was like thought out at all. I think like they had to get 200 Americans. They went through a list of international relations professors, and I was on that because most Americans do believe, most professors of international relations. I don't know. That might be strong enough. Agree with the U.S. hegemonic project, so it's not exactly crazy. But Ben, we got to go. We got another interview, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, sanctioned and sanctioned by Russia.
And sanctioned.
Yes, sanctioned by Russia, but not by this show. Thanks, guys. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.